Welcome to the Gray Podcast, Between the Black and White, a bi-weekly podcast about current events through the lens of a white therapist, Black objectivist, and white analyst. I'm Vanessa.
I'm Clifford.
And I'm John.
And this is episode 1, addressing the issues facing the world as of the date of this recording in June of 2020. In today's episode, we'll give you a chance to get to know us as we introduce ourselves and what inspired these conversations. So hello, gentlemen. It's good to be chatting with you here in this space.
Hey, it's good to be chatting with you guys also. It's been a while.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so one of the things that popped up for me as Clifford and John reached out and we started talking about creating a podcast during this time, which is, arguably one of the most significant times in our history. Certainly one of the most significant times in our history in terms of what I've gotten to witness in my life. And the theme of freedom kept popping up for me, granted as a white person, but I was really aware of what was going on socially and the timing of us really leaning into this podcast, which nestled itself in between two holidays that were really focused on the idea of freedom. And I thought as we're holding space for the Black collective in a new way, and it seems like people are really kind of waking up to the needs of Black communities in America, I just thought it was really interesting that we decided to start having these conversations right in between Juneteenth and the 4th of July. And what came up for me was that, growing up as a white person in New York, the 4th of July was always a really exciting summer holiday. There was always a lot of fireworks and we had our sparklers and barbecues and family came over and everybody was wearing red, white, and blue. And it was all of this really patriotic stuff that I didn't quite know what it meant, but I thought yay, America, we live here, we're free, and this feels really good. And it wasn't until I grew up that I realized that's not true for everybody. And that whole 4th of July thing is really a predominantly white experience of freedom because Black people in this country didn't get their freedom until nearly 100 years later. And that really sort of created a kind of jaded relationship, I think, that I had with the 4th of July once I realized that and realized that we're spending so much, or we're putting so much focus on this day of freedom for Americans, but we're leaving out so many people. And not only are we leaving them out because they didn't have freedom, but during that time, we're talking about people that were still being kept as property and not seen as whole humans. And so it's sort of this shadow of the 4th of July, this big celebration that we all have. And so that was just something that really kind of crept up for me these last couple of years, where I'd look around at people celebrating the 4th of July and just be like, what freedom are you celebrating? Whose freedom are you celebrating? What is the excitement of this holiday? And how is it that you are so able to ignore the egregious behavior that was happening right underfoot of this holiday? So I was actually really excited, Clifford, that you reached out when you did, because it gave me an opportunity to just kind of reflect on my experience as a white person and how it wasn't until a couple of years ago, I think, when I was watching an episode of Atlanta, that I even realized that people still celebrated Juneteenth. I had no idea that it was a thing that people celebrated because that's how under the radar it is. And that's so different contrasted to the 4th of July, which takes up aisles of the supermarket, and there's just flags everywhere. And so just really glad to be starting these conversations about current events and politics and all of these really important things with you guys from our different perspectives during this time. So hi, and welcome to, I guess, our conversations about freedom.
Even this is kind of an idea that's been in the works, I feel subconsciously for a while. Me and John knew each other from Twitter between maybe 2013, 2015, 16 was the highlight of, I guess, my Twitter experience. And one day, John and I were just talking about fair media representation, unbiased media. And I was one day we should just make a website called The Gray, and we'll just have an objective perspective. We'll give both sides and just kind of present the facts, which was what news should always be. Mm-hmm. So fast forward 4 years later, I had John on an episode of my podcast, the Live, Live, Love podcast. And I think probably 3 or 4 episodes before that, I had you on. And I guess this year has kind of been me really reconnecting with people from the past. And it makes sense with everything, with the climate of everything going on, just to kind of see where people are and wanting to have like-minded conversations or have constructive, conflictive conversations So I presented the idea to John and another friend of ours named John, who I knew from Twitter also. He wasn't able to do it. And like the first person that came to mind was like Vanessa. I think it's a perfect balance. You know, she's smart as hell. And I think it'll be, I thought it would be a great ebb and flow and just kind of push back in terms of perspective. You know, me being like a Black objectivist, John being a white analyst, the white guy, you know, white from New Jersey, and you being a white woman. I feel like it's a good balance and nice roundabout perspective that'll allow us to kind of educate each other on perspectives and feelings. I'm sure we'll have a lot to agree on and a lot to push back on and unravel. It's going to be fun, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm excited for it.
So am I. And real quick, I want to get back to what Vanessa was talking about with Juneteenth. This is kind of embarrassing. Up until last August, I was a history teacher. I went to school for history and political science and criminal justice, teaching creds, all that stuff. I hadn't heard of Juneteenth until last year. Just flatly hadn't heard of it. This is despite spending literally years studying American history. It's not something that's widely celebrated in my area at all. It's just completely absent from day-to-day life. And frankly, once I learned of it, I was quite embarrassed that I hadn't heard of it yet. Obviously, July 4th is such a big deal everywhere. You know, I remember some of my first summer memories I can think back on are going to stand at a local park and watch fireworks on the 4th of July. It's just a thing you did. Going all through school from, you know, pre-K through 2015 when I graduated college, you know, oh, July 4th is celebrated because of this reason, this reason, this reason. That's what you're told. There is an element of, I don't think it's intentional really, but indoctrination there that like, we became free and independent on this date. We being everyone. And with hindsight, as Vanessa was saying, it's just not true. So yeah, anyway, I'm also very excited to do this podcast. Yeah.
No,
I'll do you one better. Sorry, John. I didn't learn about Juneteenth until 2017, and it wasn't. The only reason I learned about it is because I was watching Blackish, and it was season 4, the first episode, where Dre was just going through what it meant, and I was just sitting there like, I've never ever heard about this before. And part of it is because my family, I assume is because my family's West Indian, being from Haiti. We just kind of take on whatever the general American holidays are. I don't think my mother would be aware about Juneteenth, and I don't really have that many Black American, African American friends, however you want to phrase it. And I think the few I do aren't really socially aware, or I guess generally in the know of things. So don't feel bad at all, because I just learned about it literally 3 years ago.
Wow, that's wild. And so you learned it from a TV show, and so did I. I was watching Atlanta, and they had a whole episode, and I was like, huh, this is super interesting. So isn't that cool that, like, first of all, I think that speaks to how important it is for Black people, for everybody really, who's not in the dominant majority, to have representation in entertainment, because you and I got a huge history lesson by watching TV shows. And John, for you, that blows my mind that you were studying history for that long and it had like never come up. How did you eventually learn about it?
Like one does when in a small town. I was drinking at a local bar, and a friend of mine who is white, he was like, "Hey man, today's Juneteenth." Looked at him, "What the hell is that?" And he sat down and explained to me. He's like, "Oh, that should be a bigger deal. Why don't we talk about this ever? Why am I just learning about it now?" That's how I've done a cursory research on my own, just learning about how and where it's celebrated, to say the least. And I'm sure as this series goes on, we'll talk quite a bit about my lovely little town here. It's not something that people will ever acknowledge here.
Not even acknowledge, like, not with like the intention of celebrating or doing anything about, but just kind of acknowledging that it's a date in history that is really important to a lot of Black communities?
No. They'll understand that it's literally June 19th of whatever year, but that it's important or symbolic in some way is, I don't say never, but to a large portion of the people that live around me, it's irrelevant to their lives. For context, I live in an area that's about 95% white. So, and has a very long history of racism and ignorance. And it's just not something that would come up, and it's not something that anyone would really particularly care about.
Yeah, there's not enough resonance with it.
No.
Not even with like the need for, like, I live in LA, and I've been very clear when I talk to my white friends about Juneteenth, who are like, we should make this a national holiday. And I'm like, well, I mean, maybe we should. I don't know if white people should be declaring that, or if that should be something that Black people get to own and say, yes, we want this to be a national holiday observed in that way. But whatever ends up happening to it, I think white people need to always just be very careful about not, we tend to center ourselves. We're really good at that. We need to not center ourselves around Juneteenth. But I see the impact because I live in LA. So I touch a lot of really, I hate the word diverse these days, but that's what they are, communities. And I see like the need for like Black people to be like this, or at least some of the Black people that I've been talking to about this. It's like, this is an important day in the history of our culture, of where we come from. And the fact that it's not even ignored and not celebrated, but that people don't even know that it's a thing, like it hurts them, right? So I guess for us in our community, the resonance is we see that it is important. It is a cherished day for our Black communities here. And so if that's enough for me to like get behind it and say, yeah, whatever you need this to be, I'll rally for it. That works. But it sounds like in your community, like there isn't that resonance. And I think that makes sense. And I think that's why it took us all until this late in our life to even know that it was a thing.
I mean, have you seen any celebrations for Juneteenth in LA?
I have, and I've stayed away from them because they're not my place. But they've been everywhere. Yeah.
I went to like my first Juneteenth parade experience. I think last Saturday actually, and for me, I've always felt like I'm in a weird space when it comes to African American history and moments as a Haitian American, because I'm aware the history is my history, but I'm also aware that the history and events that occurred make it possible for me and my family to be here to enjoy some type of success and part of the full American dream. So it's kind of going to your point of just seeing more representation in television. Like going back to like all the Black shows that existed, like Martin, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, thinking about the Cosby Show. Like none of those shows talked about it. So it's interesting thinking about that now in the past and comparing it to now, just kind of creativity in terms of sharing the Black experience with America at a wider scale now.
Yeah, it almost feels like older shows had to, not to say that doesn't still happen now, but I think people don't care as much. If we look at like Blackish in and of itself is like a show of protest. It's like, we're going to show up and we're going to show you this family, and it's going to be honest to the way we want to tell the story, not the way you want to hear the story. I mean, Atlanta was created as its own protest too. Like Donald Glover's like, no, like we're going to dive into an honest portrayal of Black experiences, not a whitewashed version or a white accepted version, which is, I wonder if maybe like the Cosby Show was under that kind of pressure at that time to be like, no, of course you can't talk about Juneteenth. You have to talk about stuff that white people are going to want to listen to. Otherwise you're going to go off the air. I wonder if that was part of it.
Yeah. I feel like I had a conversation with a professor, I don't remember, maybe 2010. And we were just talking about the different, I guess, main Black shows in the 80s and 90s. And looking back at the Cosby Show, they didn't really go through it. Like they had a nice plush life. And sure. I think about shows like Family Matters. And I remember there's been this clip circulating on Instagram where Eddie was harassed by these two cops, and Carl goes to this diner to confront the two cops. And those shows had more raw power to them. but they didn't get the notoriety nationally like the Cosby Show did. And maybe it is because the Cosby Show kind of just played it safe.
Mm. That's so interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, the Cosby Show was also like, it was epic. It was like an amazing show.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, it was brilliant. But you're right. They had it. They lived in a brownstone in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like, that's the dream.
Lawyer, doctor, parents,
Yeah.
and a mass of children. Like, I mean, they like really thinking about how many kids do they have? Like 5, 6.
6, and then Olivia, the niece, or the grandkid came, or yeah.
And
There's a lot of kids.
outside of I think it was Vanessa and Elvin. Like, I feel like everyone was okay financially for the most part. They all went to college. I mean, this is just me pulling from memory. I feel like they all kind of went to college. They all had these doors available for them, but they just kind of took whatever different paths they needed to kind of make their experience more, I guess, more real. Like, you can't have a show where everyone's successful and everyone's doing good. You have a couple of kids who just trying to get by and figure things out.
Yeah, that's a good point. I kind of forgot that. I think it was Sandra and Elvin. They weren't doing well financially, actually. She was the oldest of their kids.
Yeah.
But, and I think, the Cosbys really did also focus on like, get that amazing education, like transform that into whatever you can. And not all of the kids, like, they may have wanted the education, but it didn't always transfer into something super successful. But when you're comparing yourself to like a doctor dad and a lawyer mom, like, how successful can you be, right? You're going to either become another doctor or a lawyer, or you're going to become like an astronaut and surpass them. But other than that, you're always going to kind of fall short a little bit, But I think it was telling a different story. I think you're right. And so that's why I appreciate the Blackish and the Atlantas of the world now, because they do get to tell a story that, I mean, again, educates us in a way that we couldn't get educated in our schooling system, which I don't know if you guys have been seeing. I can't remember her name, and this is terrible, but there's a white woman who does a lot of like anti-racist work, and she calls the education system in America indoctrination. And I think, John, you used that word too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I also think it's fair to say that for the most part, it's not a conscious objective to, indoctrinate kids into whatever. There's so many things, though, that are absolutely telling and frankly terrifying and really kind of fascist when you think about it. Like the Pledge of Allegiance. When I worked in schools, I would never say that. Kids are free to do what they want, but if it's up to me, no. I think it's wrong. I don't like the idea of swearing loyalty to a country regardless of, ideology. I think that's flatly wrong. And I think being objective and being critical of where you live and the powers that be is, frankly, one of the most patriotic things you can do. But then you go a little further, and as a history teacher, I certainly ran into this a lot. The history books written by, McGraw-Hill and Pearson and whatever, they projected a lot of America first and America best thought.
As they should, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes and no. It's hard to, I don't know. I kind of have really complicated feelings about it.
And I think I think it's a complicated thing, right? So your feelings are valid.
Yeah. At one end, a lot of it is there's a lack of time. There's only so much you can really get through. And if you're looking at, studying American history to a point, not fully, but to a point, there's in that limited time frame, some of the stuff does get left on the wayside. When I was teaching, I always tried to make a point of, bring the conversation back to, okay, these people were doing really well, but why? Who was at fault here? Or who was suffering here? There was a chapter in the history book about Christopher Columbus. Of course there was. And, it's stuff like, and though some people thought he was bad, blah, 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 blah. It's like, all right, we're going to stop here, and we're going to take Columbus Day, and, here's some passages from, I forget his name, the priest that was with Columbus, Francisco something, and Howard Zinn's, People's History in America. We're going to read some passages out and let's see what really happened here. this is to a group of 4th and 5th graders. So like, I did my best to like at least give some background and some like, hey, it's not all roses. But not everyone does that, and there is an honest component of lack of time that kind of hurts. But it is critical, I think, and there are more teachers doing it. When I was growing up, I ran a lot into. I mean, I vividly remember doing the Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 song.
Yeah.
Yeah. That doesn't happen anymore. So, like, things are changing, but they're changing very slowly as things do. It's a generational shift. It's going to take a generation, at least. It is what it is. I think there's ample room for pushback and a desire to see better. I think that's always should be the goal. And I think it is important to be objective about the country, but from a classroom management standpoint and from a relationship with parents standpoint, you can't go too far or else you'll be criticized.
Right. Yeah.
You can't make 10-year-olds revolutionaries.
Right. Totally.
You can, I mean, right?
Well, you can. It's frowned upon.
Were the kids receptive to the other perspective? Like, what were their responses to learning? To the story.
A lot of them are just really taken aback, surprised. Towards the end of the year, we'd circle back around to where did we get? Yeah, like at the end of the year with 5th graders, we're looking at the U.S. Constitution. So made a point of like, hey, Black people were considered 3/5 of a person at this point, or 13th Amendment that doesn't abolish slavery in prisons. That sort of stuff. They were surprised by, but at the same time, like, oh yeah, I understand it. Like, they could kind of see it coming a little bit.
Interesting. That there'd be like spoilers along the way that would lead up to, yeah, this is probably what's going to happen here. Yeah. Yeah, I honor that too. Just the whole the classroom management part. I mean, first of all, there's a lot of history to cover. There's a lot of stuff that's not going to make it, and it does have to be age appropriate. So, like if you're teaching a 4th grader, there might be some things that maybe they're not going to get the details of in our history because some of our history is that dark. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So I totally get that part. And I don't think it's a malicious thing, at least certainly not in current times, that it's a little bit more whitewashed than maybe it ought to be.
No, and certainly not at the individual teacher level.
Totally.
I doubt, or even by and large, administrative curriculum level, there's nothing intentional or malicious there. I don't believe, at least. I mean, I'm sure there is here and there, but for the most part, broadly speaking, it's a lot of people kind of just doing what they've always done. There's so much inertia in education that it's really hard to stop and rethink, reevaluate things to make them more to date with the current zeitgeist.
Yeah.
Do you know how often textbooks are I guess updated when it comes to history books? I imagine that history is really the only main subject where textbooks need to be updated frequently, where there's major changes, because you always have to add, what happened the past 5 years, 10 years. So they're written and updated yearly.
Okay. However, that certainly does not mean that schools receive them. Right. The ones I was using weren't that old. They're within 5 years old or so. But when I went to school, we were using history books that still listed the USSR. So
right.
Yeah,
I remember that too. Yeah,
yeah. So schools are consistently and constantly under budgeted, which is a big factor here too.
Yeah.
So when the curriculum provided by the textbook or the textbook itself that you have to use, when it's limited in that way, that it's 15 years old, it kind of hurts as well. You can always go out and do your own thing, but that's incredibly stressful and time consuming. So it makes things difficult. Schools doesn't have money to spend on new textbooks. History isn't a tested subject, at least in New Jersey. So it's not one they're going to really care about too much. So at least in New Jersey, I can't speak for other states. kids in 4th through at least 8th grade. I think there's a couple tests in high school as well. They're tested yearly on like a large standardized test that looks at language arts and literacy and math. So those are the only 2 subjects that matter. Like seriously, they're the only 2 that matter. Everything else has to tie back into those 2 subjects in some way, shape, or form to, some cross-curricular activities to make sure kids are retaining that language arts literacy and math skill component even when they're in science or when they're in history or whatever. So that's another thing. History and science a little less so with a focus on STEM, but history especially is the least notable of the core subjects.
I never thought about that until you just said it, that because it isn't one of the core ones that's tested, it's not going to get a lot of attention. Of course. Duh. Mm-hmm. Well, and it also, as you're talking about, like, it's certainly not malicious on behalf of like the teachers or the individuals that are involved. And I absolutely believe that. I think if anything, it just serves as like maybe some sort of representation of how collectively America holds its own history. And then it just perpetuates it because then we're teaching the kids. And I would imagine that in communities where schools are less funded, their textbooks are getting updated way less frequently. Is that a correct assumption?
By and large, yeah.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. You don't still teach now, do you?
No, and that's a whole different subject if you want to delve into that as well. But no, I'm no longer a teacher.
If you were, would you see the value in teaching the kids about Juneteenth or like rallying for that to be part of the curriculum?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't miss teaching, but the last like month or 2 months has been one of those moments like, ooh, I'd really like to get back in the classroom just to talk about, the current events happening right now. Juneteenth being one of them. I think it's pretty critically important.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it sounds like we need to have a whole episode on why you're not teaching anymore.
It boils down to, and now I have a much less stressful job that pays me more.
Got it.
Which I mean, says a lot about education, dude. And the amount of work that's put onto teachers and how little they're compensated for it. But,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think that especially given the weight of the 4th of July, because I've gotten to the point where I just don't celebrate the 4th of July anymore. I'm almost like in a state of protest. Like last year on the 4th of July, I literally wore all black because I was like in this emo state of just like, no, I will not participate in this because it is dangerous. Like I was kind of going off on a thing last year. I'm a little less aggressive about it this year. But it is interesting because like my dad really likes the 4th of July and he's like, go America. He's also a Trump supporter. So it kind of in lines with, it's on brand for him. But that's what I started to kind of attach it to, is like these overt celebrations of American freedom on the 4th of July, because they're missing such a huge component to me. I was like, no, I'm not even going to celebrate this, but instead I'm going to go tell everybody that I know about Juneteenth, because most of the people I told about had no idea that it existed. So I love the idea of just like increasing the amount of conversations and putting it in front of people, which I think given the social climate now, like people know about Juneteenth now, like it's been talked about. If you're not knowing about Juneteenth now, I think you're willfully not paying attention. At least that's been my experience talking to people and on social media. I don't know if maybe I'm alone in that. Have you guys seen a lot of Juneteenth stuff?
Yeah, I definitely have. I think on Juneteenth, that was pretty much my entire Instagram feed, just people. I mean, granted, it is the people I follow. I follow people who are progressive and who want to put out informative information and just who are looking at make sure that people are aware. I had someone reach out to me because they were questioning the celebration. If slavery ended 2 years ago, why not celebrate when slavery initially ended versus that moment of Juneteenth when it happened? And I thought about it for a second, and I responded with the general idea that, there's a general black narrative of we're not free until we're all free, right? Mm-hmm. Until every single one of us is free, none of us is really free. I think that's more so how it goes. So Juneteenth is the realization and the stamp. Okay, we're all officially free now. So this is when we focus on celebrating the end of slavery.
Yeah. That makes total sense. I think even the fact that there was such a delay that it took, those years until Texas finally got the news and was able to live, the people in Texas, the slaves in Texas were able to be freed. I think that in of itself is such a significant part of that story, that it wasn't just like, okay, slavery is abolished, everything's fine, let's move on, right? Like that's not what happened at all. And part of the proof of that is that it took that long for the news to travel and for people to actually get to live the freedom that they were promised, right? So yeah, we're not free until we're all free. And I think that's a beautiful sentiment of the date that is celebrated for that. I love
And it
that.
speaks to what the Black experience has kind of always been in terms of just unity and always supporting and looking out for each other. And I mean, being forced into that social construct of we all suffer together. I mean, that's what slavery kind of was, right? If one slave committed an act, everyone suffered, or someone who wasn't guilty suffered in place as a reminder and as a way to kind of deter future rebellion. I mean, it's a lot of a psychological psyop work, right?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. Well, it makes sense. John, I know you were saying that it's not, the conversations about Juneteenth weren't present in your community. Were you also seeing it though on social media a lot?
Oh, of course. At least from like the more left-leaning and progressive people I know and follow, even within my community, like, yes, they, are posting about it, but it didn't make its way into the collective conscience of the community. Like, even on social media, there was nothing on, the various community pages. It was just another day.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, that makes sense. And I guess, we've got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
Which, better late than never. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that as a white person, but that's where we're at right now. I know that both of you have also been, showing up in your communities and taking to the streets in demonstrations. And Clifford, I think that, in terms of just like trying to affect change and, moving forward in a better direction, I know that you went to a protest in Denver that kind of like stood out to you.
Yeah, it's been a interesting past few months.
Yeah.
So there are certain things that I don't want to talk about because I just feel like it might expose more than I'm willing to share or put other people in other predicaments. But
Yeah.
I went to a protest on a Sunday, and it was very much the vibe and energy that I was kind of looking forward to. I hadn't been to a protest since maybe 2016, maybe. I think it was like an anti-Trump rally in New York, and just being busy with life and not being involved and just, like feeling hopeless about society, which is just kind of my general pessimistic, realistic reality.
It's your
But
baseline, yeah.
right. But this moment felt different for me. It was important, and I live in Denver, Colorado, and being in a city and state that is predominantly white, for me, it was important to be out there as a Black person. To one, hopefully connect with other Black people, to see that there are other Black people here who care, and just to be on the ground and just be another body, be another voice. When I initially moved here, I told one of my friends, asked me how it was going and how things were diversity wise. And I said, I felt like all the Black people that moved to Denver moved here to avoid other Black people, because I'd be in these different areas, and the usual Black experience when you're in a predominantly non-Black area is just acknowledgement. It's just going back to the idea of unity and community, and we're all, going to look out for each other. I'd see other Black people and I'd greet them and they'd ignore me. So I was like, okay, like they don't want to be bothered. So I got it. But when I went to that protest, I saw the passion, I felt the energy. And that first day that I went was, I said, it was the energy that I needed. And it felt good to see so many people show up. It felt good to see so many Black faces. And it felt good to not kind of feel alone in this city state. And the following Wednesday, went to another protest, and the narrative just kind of changed. It was, I felt that the energy was off almost immediately. There were people on stage playing music, there was dancing. I saw people like booty popping on the stage. And in my mind, I was like, this reiterates the idea of Black people entertaining white people. And that just kind of being the core of what Black is, right? Once you entertain, once you're on the stage dancing and waving your hands, everyone cheers because they love it. And I understand that it's nuanced. It's a form of just representation and energy and releasing energy also. But for me, it took away from what the moment was about. That we weren't, in my mind, that's not what we're here for. We're here to rally. We're here to make our voices heard. We're here to disrupt peacefully. And if need be, non-peacefully, if the response is, if we meet a opposing response, especially from the police officers. So those first few nights, like I did an episode with one of the, I consider her like one of the main protesters in Denver. And she said that when she went to a protest that prior Friday, she was just standing around with a group of people near Capitol Hill, and police just kind of pulled up and just started pepper spraying people, like out the blue, like no warning, no nothing, just take that, eat that, get, disperse.
Yeah. And
so that Wednesday, when the mood started shifting, I remember these were Black men. I also want to make that clear because for me, it's very important. One of them was on stage, and he was saying, I'm noticing a lot of litter on the ground. You guys need to clean up. And on my mind, I'm like, that's not what we're here for. Like, we're here to fuck shit up if need be. So if the streets get dirty, then that's just what it is. Like, we're not here to make peace and harmony. So the day kind of transitioned. We went to Civic Center, which is like a 2-minute walk. And there were people on stage talking. And then the mayor came out and the police chief came out. And this wasn't information I was privy to until they got on stage and kind of acknowledged themselves. I never knew Denver's mayor was Black. I never really cared, honestly. I didn't care who the mayor was. I was like, like I've been moving through cities for the past 6 years. So I'm like, maybe I'll settle down. Maybe I won't. But seeing a Black man on stage, I was like, okay, like there was some type of reassurance, not naively. And he had people from his team talking, and there was one gentleman who talked about just being frustrated with the system and everything going on. And he was the only person that I heard on that stage, like really talking from a place of passion and frustration. And he ended his speech with the idea with saying that cops would start being held responsible moving forward. But he got quickly shut down. They were like, he's young. He's young. He doesn't understand. He's just saying things. And so the mayor just kept talking. And there was this gentleman a couple of feet away from me. And he just started like heckling. And he was like, no. This is not a political rally for the mayor. No. And he kept repeating. And that reassured me that I wasn't making things up. It reassured me that something felt off with whatever was going on. So later that day, me and my fiance, we left because it wasn't the same mood anymore. It wasn't the energy. And then I went online to Twitter, and I have a tweet deck, and I have a column that just says Denver protest. So whenever anyone posts or tweets rather about Denver protest, I see that feed, or rather I see their tweet, and I engage with them. I'd retweet them, or I'd respond to them, excuse me. And there was one, the lead protester, her name is Isabella, and she just tweeted exactly what I've been thinking, that we use the term co-opted, that the protests felt like they've been co-opted. Like, you have protesters here working with the mayor and the city office, but just last night you were getting pepper sprayed and tear gas. Like, what's going on? There was even a video of the cops throwing tear gas at this gentleman's car, and he was driving his pregnant wife to the hospital. And they were on this, on that day on Wednesday, they were on the stage talking about unity. And again, I just kind of felt that energy shift. So I went back I was on Reddit also, and just connecting with people. Like, hey, did anyone notice? Like, this seems kind of off. Like, why are we talking about all lives matter now? Like, when did this transition happen? And then it just kind of exploded into this bigger connectivity aspect where I was just on Reddit trying to connect with people who felt exactly the way that I felt. And I started speaking to the young lady Isabella a bit more, and just trying to find a way to connect so we can get the movement back on track. And it's been, I went to a protest after that, and like the energy is just dead. Like people were dancing in the streets, they had music playing, and I was like, all right, this is officially over. And then me and my fiance ended up going to a protest ran by a different organization, which is PSL, and I forget what it stands for. Socialism Liberation. I forgot what the P stands for. And that was kind of more my speed because they were young, they had the energy, they were still on that, fuck the police aspect, which isn't my complete narrative, but I felt that energy is still what's needed. So things just kind of transitioned, things just kind of died down. I remember either the mayor or someone on stage just saying that, Sunday is the last day for protest. And I'm like, when did you decide that? Like, isn't a protest supposed to be just us kind of out here responding and doing what we want? Like, since when does the authority tell us when the protest is over? And then I just knew that
it does not have a end date.
Right.
Yeah, that's bizarre.
Yeah, and I knew then that it was over, and then I just started. I think was it you, Johnny? I think you and I were talking about it. And I think you sent me that link about protests throughout the nations being co-opted. Was that you?
I don't think so, but we did talk about this quite a bit, actually. Yeah,
I can't remember who sent it to me. Yeah, but it's something that's been going on nationwide. Just these, and I go back to the idea of just being naive and thinking because I saw Black faces on stage that they would have the Black interest at heart, but it just seemed like they were just playing the agenda, playing the role. They let the protesters get out their initial energy. When they came in, they swept in, they pacified everyone, and it worked. And then it transitioned into anyone who was still out there protesting. Like now you kind of became the villain. Like what are you arguing for? What are you protesting for? Like we resolved everything. Everything's fine, but it's not. It still isn't.
No, and that's a dirty game. That's such a dirty game to almost like, in a sense, like gaslight all these people that showed up. Right. To be like, okay, here's some talking points, some feel good messages. Now we're done. Protests are over. Let's move on with our lives. That's gross.
Yeah, those weeks were just, it was just disheartening, really, just to kind of see that transition. But it reinforced the reality of the general idea of, all skin folk and kinfolk, which is what Black people like to say. And it was a wake up call. And I mean, it's very much just the narrative of how the nation works, right? Of, no one's going to allow civil disobedience and unrest. You're going to manipulate it. You're going to create the situation and you're going to guide it as best as you can. So people think they have the freedom and guidance to kind of do what they want, but they really don't. I mean, that's just the narrative of America, right?
Yeah, and I mean, in times of social unrest, like we're certainly seeing now, there's so much room for grifters to come in and, like you're saying, co-opt a movement. There's nothing authority figures love more than a quote-unquote good protester, like one that says some of the right things, but has no intention of pursuing further action, because it lets people say like, oh, we're protesting, we're doing good, but nothing's fucking getting done. So of course they'll try, the people in power will try to allow those that act that way to weasel their way towards the top. It's incredibly frustrating, and it's one of those things you really have to keep an eye out on and do what you can to shut them down, because it's pretty easy to end a movement like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the co-opting is so popular. I mean, I think it's like once there's like somebody else did all of the work to get the attention on this particular thing. And so let me, whatever it is, whatever my stance is, let me swoop in and kind of take the spotlight of that. but it effectively kind of like tear down the mission of the movement to begin with.
Right. And there's been overall great response. I mean, there were people made flyers. There are flyers going around just kind of disavowing the organization, saying that they work with the Denver police, don't trust them. So there's been a lot of pushback. And I feel like overall their whole brand has kind of been discredited, which is amazing and important. But a lot of the momentum has kind of died out, but it's so slowly picking up back up again, mostly because of the Elijah McClain incident that happened last year. So people are going to protest and kind of bring it back to the streets again, which I'm very happy and humbled about.
Yeah, I would still imagine, and I mean, disheartening was the word that was coming to mind as you were telling that story, as you were saying, like, you naively felt this sense of like calm or confidence or just reassurance that there was a Black man on stage, and how that got taken away from you in that moment once you realized what was really happening. I mean, your spidey sensors were going off from the beginning, where you were like, something feels off about this. And so I just honor that that's a tough experience in all of this. You're looking for allies. You're looking for people who you can follow or who you can cheer for or who are going to look out for you. And you've still got to be hyper vigilant for the people that are taking advantage of that.
Yeah, it's, again, Denver is predominantly white. Colorado is predominantly white. So
Right.
Being a Black mayor in a predominantly white city, white state, like there's power behind that. There's a lot of, and I understand both aspects. I understand that at the end of the day, he has people he answers to. And the reality is that no matter what position you hold as a Black person or pretty much any person, at the end of the day, you're answering to somebody white. That's just the reality.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that he has to play the political game. It's fine. I get it. I mean, not fine in a sense of it's okay and acceptable. I understand it on a human aspect in terms of being in power, being in a certain position, and maybe wanting to do right, but then you meet with the people at the top, and they tell you this is how it's going to be, or XYZ happens, because everyone I feel like everyone in a political role has dirt on each other. So maybe that's why everyone just kind of plays the game and turns a blind eye, because no one wants their dirt revealed. But being in a again, position of power, being a minority group in a city like Denver, there's a responsibility, I feel, that all Black leaders have to send the right message and set the tone, because everyone's here for whatever you say, whatever you want to do. That's what people are going to do. So having a moment, especially like this, where you can guide and control and shape the future of people's perceptions and their children's perceptions and other generations, just to kind of squander that for whatever reasons, it seems wasteful. It's disrespectful, and it just kind of creates this reignites or reinforces the disconnect and disinterest for me when it comes to just people in power or just people in general. Like, going back to pessimism, just feel like you just can't trust anybody. It sucks.
Yeah. That was one of the first things. I mean, there's like, you could separate it where it's like people in power versus the people, and how there's like always going to be distrust there, because there's always a game that politicians are playing, or there's a system there that we're not privy to if we're not on the inside. And so whatever motivations they're riding on may never entirely make sense to us. But you're right, just as on a human level, that there does have to be this discernment between people, and that a distrust could come that could so like dysregulate a movement or a really important message of humanity, right? It's just, that's sad. That is just sad. I mean, it makes sense, but it's sad. Like, it's inevitable and it's sad.
Yeah. I mean, it's, you can just kind of look for, I mean, my mental shift has just become focusing on the next generation, right? Like, who are these people who are going to get these, I forgot the phrase when it comes to just the old guards, I guess. Just get them out of here. Like, it's like, you guys have had your run. Like, there is no basic care for humanity. When we went to a George Floyd vigil, and the Attorney General of Colorado rather, was there. And, he was talking about unity and all that good stuff that you want to hear. And I had just recently heard about the Elijah McClain story, and I've posted about it, I've tweeted about it, just how devastating that experience is. And I can't even watch like 10 seconds of the body cam footage or listen to the audio, because it just shakes me, and makes me feel this hopeless in terms of who are the people, who are these people in the streets with authority over our lives, just kind of doing whatever they want. So I googled when the Attorney General got in office, and that was January 2019. The Elijah McClain incident happened August 2019, and I was just looking at him on stage, like this Elijah McClain story never made it to your desk. Like, no one ever brought this up to you. I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt sometimes, because that's my base in terms of being fair. Like, maybe he didn't know, but the reality is, like, no, things like that, stories like that, especially large officer involved incidents, murders, that's going to come to you. And the fact that you didn't do anything back then, but now you want to come out tonight and show face, I mean, for me, it means you don't have the basic sense of humanity in you. Like, if it takes people rallying and protesting, and you want to blame it on the looters and whatever to get a positive response out of you, then what are you in that position for? This isn't, you're not here to serve the public, right? It just goes back to politicians just being in it for self, essentially.
Yeah. But the whole lack of empathy and humanity that can come from that, I think that's part of, like, we talk about the systems in this country and how they're built to harm certain people. We need to, not even just reform the system, but maybe tear it down and rebuild it in some new image. But at the end of the day, the hardest part of this is not so much the power, but that there are so many humans who are able to suspend their empathy, or who have lost touch with their humanity enough that they could do what they did to Elijah McClain. I was watching, Dave Chappelle did a weird sort of COVID show at the beginning of June called 8:46, which is, the time that George Floyd had a knee on his neck. And Dave Chappelle is saying, like, who are you? Who are you talking to? What are you about if you can put your knee on this man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and not think that you are going to face the wrath of God? It's like this idea that people are above it somehow, or impervious to whatever faith that they carry around that tells them to, like, no, just don't be a horrible person. Like, that's really all it is at the end of the day, right? We shouldn't even need a sort of like existential punisher or like reward or punishment system to keep us in line, but we should just have enough of a conscience and empathy that we wouldn't be doing these things to people, and that people are doing it, and it's happening so pervasively, and it's just heartbreaking.
So I think part of that, at least from having conversations with people largely in my community, haven't really been able to get outside of my community thanks to the ongoing pandemic. But part of it is a lot of people were brought up to have a pretty strict reverence for authority figures. Taught from, I don't know, the time that they can understand and interpret words, that cops are the good guys, and, raised to give them every single benefit of every single doubt. And to question authority means you're doing something wrong. So for a lot of people, it's hard to break that. Something you've been hearing for, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, to break that ideology that you've literally lived your whole life having. My mom in particular has come quite a long ways with this. I'm genuinely impressed. She's, she was born in the late 60s, and for her, in most of her life, that's what it was. Cops are good guys. You respect the law, respect authority, et cetera, et cetera. But recently, she has taken a little bit of a turn here, where she looks at things like Elijah McClain case and George Floyd, and is very willing to say, like, yeah, this is wrong. I don't understand why this is allowed to happen, why this can exist. So her being able to do that gives me quite a lot of hope. But she is, just one person, and there are still many that are, where was I? I was out at a zoo last weekend and you saw several people with the Blue Lives Matter t-shirts on. And it's just, that is where it's disheartening. And that's, for me, frankly, maddening to see people wearing that kind of stuff. Like, what point are you trying to prove here? How many boots are you going to lick? Like, what do you want? Do you want to live in a police state? Do you want to continue to hand the monopoly of violence in this country over to people who have proven time and time again that they are not responsible enough to hold it? What is your aim here? And that's where I get mad. Try to give people, understanding that they simply don't know any better. They are ignorant to the faults of the police and of authority writ large in this country. That's fair. Up until recently, that's fair to not truly understand that and to not know it and to not see it, especially in a place where I live, which is ultra rural. We don't even have a police force in my town.
So what do you guys have then?
We have a state police barracks about 20 minutes away.
Okay, wow.
Yeah. So,
real quick, do you think your town rather needs it?
No, God, no.
Okay,
absolutely not. Yeah.
Well, I mean, not in terms of what policing has become, but just the representation of the possibilities of just having people in a community who are there to kind of serve and protect. If it was the ideal serve and protecting.
No, because it doesn't make budgetary sense to run at least a decent police force. You'd be looking at like 7 officers plus cars plus a building and all that other stuff. It's at least $1 million a year. My town can't afford that. Yeah, like it's even if you remove all the social aspects of it from a strictly monetary perspective, it cannot work here without like defunding the school, which is probably not the way to go. So, yeah, I don't think it makes sense. But anyway, like I was saying, I see hope in people like my mom, and I get just viscerally angry at the people I see who are not even willing to listen to the idea that the police and people in power are not perfect and do not always have your best interest in mind. That infuriates me, and I don't know how to change it, because it's one of those things, you bring it up, they stand their ground even further to the point where it doesn't even make sense anymore.
Yeah, they double down on it, and then it's like you almost don't even know what you're fighting about anymore, because it starts to become about all of like the defenses that come up in that argument. But I love that you brought that up, because I think it's such a good point. There have been so many like sociological experiments. I mean, I think like the Stanford prison experiment comes to mind in terms of showing what power does to people, both whether you're the one that gained the power or the one on the other end of the power. There was also something called Milgram's experiment. Where I think that was sort of about trying to understand how Nazis could have just like followed along with orders, whether or not they really believed in the morality of what they were doing. And the whole experiment was basically like a person in a lab coat told you to basically electrocute somebody in another room. And so long as the person that told you to electrocute the other person was wearing a lab coat, you would do it. When another person came in without a lab coat, you didn't do it when they told you to do it. And the whole experiment is basically saying, like, if somebody comes in wearing a lab coat or wearing something that indicates that they are an authority figure, you just assume that they're right and you do the thing that they say to do. And if it's wrong, then you could always kind of fall back and say, well, the authority figure made me do it. And I think we absolutely have that relationship on a default level with law enforcement in this country. And I asked my mom to watch the 13th documentary, and she texted me afterwards and she was like, oh my God, I didn't realize this whole time that all of those presidents were brainwashing us to believe that Black people were the criminals. So she had this moment of like, they made it seem like they were keeping us safe, but nobody questioned the narrative on which that was born. And seeing it for the first time in her life, in her 60s, was like this holy shit moment for her, which I'm glad she finally had. And again, it is just one person. But I think if it's like that consciousness, that ability to even see the lie, to see that you've been brainwashed, to see that, it's not saying all authority is bad, but it is saying you should probably question it and maybe not just blindly believe that everybody that wears a badge means well or is doing the thing that they're supposed to do. So I think that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I feel like it goes back to the idea of your original point of having more content from different cultures and groups of people. There's more cultural representation and content, so people can share their stories, and hopefully people who wouldn't be as willing to initially watch it, and they get from it what they can. Everyone's like, I know, like John talked about just being one person, and you talked about your mom just being one person. That's two people. Like that's dope, right? And it's progress, as minimal as it may seem. It is necessary progress, and just having it available for watching, having the option, I guess, is what I think. That's kind of my envision, knowing that there's an option for other, like there's an option. Like I've been thinking about there's a rom-com on Netflix called Forever. Oh, damn, what's the name of it? It's with Randall Park and Alice Wong. Forever Maybe, or something like that. And it's just a nice, fun Asian, I guess, centered rom-com. And I enjoy just being able to see different groups of people doing what white people have always traditionally do. And just having that option makes it humanizes people, I guess, and it makes you see again that they're just that everyone's the same. Like we're all the same. We're all kind of going through the same life experience. We all have the same stories, essentially, regardless of cultural background. And I think that's what these past couple of years, push of just information and narratives, and Fresh Off the Boat, we talked about Blackish, even the Carmichael Show, which a lot of people, and even myself, I never watched it when it was available, and I think it got canceled after maybe 2 or 3 seasons. But watching it, I equate it to the Black Seinfeld, because it's a show about nothing essentially, but it's just about people, friends, having conversations and having life experiences and kind of going through the processes of these life experiences. So again, just having the option there. People may watch it, people won't, but the people who do, it'll ignite something in them, maybe change something in them, or if not, at least plant that initial idea to hopefully allow them to be open to further content from the non-traditional groups that they're used to.
Yeah. And I think that's such a refreshing way to learn too. Like, as much as I say, like, read the Ta-Nehisi Coates and watch the 13th and all those things, it's also like, read Black fiction, read stories, like the storytelling of people from cultures that are not your dominant culture, and just kind of immerse yourself in their world. And there's such a, like, you could learn by not even realizing that you're learning, because you're just reading or watching something that's entertaining and appeals to what you just said, Clifford, which is that shared human experience, but in a different context, one that maybe is a little bit foreign to you or unfamiliar to you, but can become more familiar to you just by exposing yourself to it casually, and realizing that these are just people trying to live and love and be successful. And there's just different obstacles in the way.
Right.
So I love telling people to, like, watch fiction. Don't just watch the documentaries.
Right. I was thinking about when you were talking about, was it the milligram experiment?
The milligram experiment, yeah.
Experiment. I'd be interested to see that same experiment, but make it race related. So a white doctor in a lab coat, a Black doctor in a lab coat, Indian doctor in a lab coat, and see who people respond to more. I feel like that'd be an interesting take on it also.
Totally. I totally agree with that. And I don't know, maybe there have been some that have done it. I just remember hearing about that one in grad school, because I went for psychology. So that was like a really significant, like, they did what? But I would imagine that there are other iterations of it, but I don't know if it covers race. And I'd be interested to see that too.
Right. So John, what's been your experience these past couple of days with the protest and organizing and being out in the streets in your town and connecting with people?
So my town specifically didn't have anything going on. In fact, I was called out on a town social media page for, like, just voicing support for the idea of one here.
Wow.
Wait, what?
Yeah. But a couple of surrounding communities have had protests. I've been to a few. They have died off in the past couple weeks. There aren't enough people or enough ingrained organizers to really keep momentum going in a place like where I live. So I went to a few. The first one was in a town about 20, 30 minutes away from me. Mostly minority. The police force is mostly white. Police force has a pretty long history of abuse of power. It was weird. It was in the early days of the protest. I think it was like late May. We got about 60 or so people, which is a good turnout. But after our little march down the street, the first speaker was the chief of police, which immediately set me off. Just like, why? What is the point of this? Mm-hmm. And, his thing was just showing unity and like, hey, we're here for you. And it's like, okay, cool. Why are you the one speaking? 1. 2, why do you have a Blue Lives Matter flag on your face mask? So I was angry just off the bat because it didn't make sense. It was just such an intimidation tactic. I don't know. I eventually went up to both the chief of police and another officer asking them about the mask. There's a couple other things I asked them about too, but the masks were the ones that really got to me because it's just such a blatant symbol of oppression and just not getting it. Like, there's only 2 options here. One is you're evil or you're just so supremely ignorant that you shouldn't deserve to be in a position of authority if you can't understand where this is coming from. And the only answer I got out of them when really pressing on it is like, they were donated, they were free, it's just a symbol, it doesn't mean anything. Now, that last sentence makes no sense because a symbol by definition means something, but that's the answer I got. So that kind of made me angry for a while. Then a couple weeks later, I went to another protest in a town right up the street from mine. That is a town that's 80% white. It has its own police force that actually, by New Jersey standards, doesn't do terribly in terms of use of force. It ranks somewhere in the middle, according to the NJ Force report. So it's like, okay, minorities are disproportionately affected, which I don't want to say that's obvious, but it's like one of those things like, yeah, that's kind of expected at this point. So that was organized by Black high school students. So that's cool, especially in a town like that is predominantly white, in a high school that's predominantly white. That was neat to see. We marched through the town with a police escort, ending up on the steps of the high school. The only speech that was given really was one of the organizers gave a brief one, and then the white president of the school board gave a shorter one, which again didn't make sense to me. We did the kneel on the ground for 8 minutes and 46 seconds thing, and then we went home. This is when I talked to Cliff. Like, I have a pretty big issue with protests that don't clearly state their demands, their objectives, and their rationale. It's like, okay, cool, we marched through the street, we showed solidarity, that's great. What's the next step here? There wasn't one, and that left me feeling rather confused and, to bring up a recurring term here, disheartened. We have momentum here. There are 150 to 200 people here in a white town known for racism. We have something here. What's next? There's a state police barracks right up the road here and the MJ State Police have a long, sordid history of racial profiling. What are we going to do? There's a jail right around the corner. We know what goes on here. Why are we stopping here and not doing anything? That left me with a very bitter taste in my mouth, and I haven't actually been to a protest since. There's, between work obligations and other things, I haven't had the time, and they've just fallen off. So that's kind of what I'm left with. In the ultra-local protests relative to where I am, I don't want to say they're meaningless because they're not. That's not fair at all. But I don't think the people who organized them were able to carry momentum over into making real change, if that makes sense, and that's fair to say.
Yeah, I mean, it almost sounds like there's more potential that could be reached in the assembly of people that's just not being tapped into. It's cool that people are showing up, especially that representation is a good sign. But you're now what? How do we make this effective?
Right, and that's the big thing for me. I want action. I'm not saying that, there should be a riot in this town or there should be a more, I hate to use the term violence in regards to property destruction because I don't think that's right. But it's just, we have to do things here. You have police officers here. Why aren't you asking them targeted questions? Why is the mayor of this town not here? Why are you asking them questions. Why aren't we marching to the jail? Why aren't we marching to the state police barracks? Like, there were more effective ways to go about it, even in terms if it's just symbolic and it's just a march and a peaceful protest, or quote unquote peaceful protest. Like, there were more effective ways to do it. I think. I don't know, and I know I'm saying that as white guy, but still, I don't know. I just feel like the moment wasn't capitalized on here, and that kind of hurts. A lot of it felt like we're just going through the motions. Everyone else is doing it, so we should too.
Right. I mean, I also think it's kind of a new experience because for the most part, it's been centralized in specific cities, like Ferguson, where the Mike Brown incident happened, and then started in Minneapolis, and then it just kind of spread out. And we expect it from these major metropolitan cities. You expect it in New York. You expect it in LA. You expect it in Chicago. But in smaller towns, it's like you kind of said, it's just a response because other people are doing it. And, maybe there's no one there to kind of really take the lead and, put their best foot forward and say, okay, I'm taking over this. This is what we're going to do. Maybe. And I also envision it, since it's a small town, there's more risk, right? You can't hide as well in small towns where you can in major cities. You can be a leader and you can, hide out in different places if you feel threatened. I don't know. I guess that's kind of my other perspective on it.
Those are absolutely fair points. 100%.
Yeah, I was going to say that's an interesting point about even just feeling like the risk of, in a place like that, it's not like the police are coming at the protesters the way that they've come at them in more metropolitan cities. But Clifford, are you kind of talking about just like maybe even reputation in a town like that of like somebody who's showing up on the front lines to fight this fight that might make a bad association for them in terms of like work and things like that?
Yeah, work. And also, I guess in terms of how far you bring the movement, people are like the Denver public school superintendent, I believe superintendent, this black guy named Tay Anderson. He's 21 years old. He's been receiving death threats. You go to his Twitter feed or his Instagram, and you see people just shit talking him. And someone went to his website and filled out a form, and they called him like a monkey and a nigger and all this other stuff. So there's a risk in any type of, I guess, authoritative position when you're doing it for the people, when you're opposing the systemic authority. There's a risk. And I think in smaller towns, or I imagine in smaller towns, you may not be willing to push against the grain. I mean, for you, like John, for example, he ran for office as a Democrat in your town, right? And like that takes courage to kind of really do that. I think you have to be willing to, number one, put yourself out there and test the limits of what you're willing to accept in response to negative feedback and negative responses from your desire to kind of want change and to push back against what your town's narrative has been for all these years.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I mean, as you brought up, I can actually speak to the whole like getting a reputation from personal experience. I ran as a Democrat last year, and a lot of Democrats in my town are like sort of the old Union Democrat mindset, like left of the Republicans, but not what you consider progressive necessarily. And like, that's fine. That's their prerogative. I'm not that. I ran as a pretty unabashed progressive in what is a very deeply conservative town. I now very much have a reputation as a like liberal asshole and as a troublemaker.
As Facebook showed you recently.
Yeah. As Facebook always shows me.
Wait, what did Facebook do?
Not Facebook like corporate, but people on Facebook. Like, I can't really say too much on like my town's page without people disregarding what I say because, oh, I'm just that liberal, whatever, or like I'm just angry because the God-fearing Republicans run, or something to that effect. Like,
yeah. Got it. I've heard it too. I'm familiar.
Yeah, I'm approaching pariah status at this point. It's fine.
Yeah, well, I mean, that obviously speaks to the risk that Clifford was talking about, and it totally makes sense. And I guess me always being in like big cities and not putting myself in quite that public forum, I never really quite think about that risk. So good for you, John, for putting yourself in that position.
Yeah, I mean, someone had to. I talked more about it when I was on Cliff's podcast, and I don't want to go too far into it because of time concerns. But I know we did talk about like people unwilling to change a little bit, and that's kind of been my town for the entirety of my life. So, like, all right, the town's going to die unless we do something different. I'm someone different, so that should be something, and that's kind of what I ran as and ran for. And it was met with a lot of resistance and people scared of change. But, you know, that's what it is.
Yeah. Well, and I bet that you, as like the face of the change that they're scared of, that is just going to make you a target because now you're representing the thing that they fear.
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah. So interesting.
But also,
go ahead.
Just real quick, it kind of adds to the idea of just putting that initial idea in people's head, right? So that although you didn't win, although there's a lot of pushback, maybe there are younger people. I mean, I feel like that's most of the work that every generation does. We all, unfortunately, kind of feel like the change won't happen within our generation. So maybe we'll just spark the initial flame, and the young generation will see it and kind of carry on and really take things to the next level. Like I mentioned, I did the episode with one of the lead protesters in Denver, and we were comparing Generation Z to millennials. And I was trying to get her perspective on how, as a representative of her generation, how they view millennials. And we were talking about how socially millennials have kind of been shunned. We get criticized for being lazy and living in our parents' home, and all these negative aspects that we've been socially conditioned into systemically, loans, job market, outsourcing. We've kind of faced and if you guys consider yourselves millennials also, we've kind of taken on the blunt response to, I guess, a lot of the detriment of what maybe the financial and social system has become. And we're kind of like a buffer, because I look at a lot of Gen Z as like they have fire in them. And I realize also that maybe it's because since we're older, we have jobs, you have responsibilities. So the system kind of forces you to shift away from being as active as you used to be. And now, since since that people are unemployed, everyone has a time to kind of go out and rally and protest. And for Generation Z, since they're not at that point where they have these larger responsibilities, and they've seen the work that all the other generations have done, they've used the Occupy Wall Street model to kind of learn how to connect and share information. They've looked at the Hong Kong protesters, and I think maybe, unfortunately, but also fortunately, that their generation might be the ones to kind of really bring that change in, because millennials, we're in the age group where we should be transitioning into authoritative roles, right? 30-year-olds should be the next senators and city council people. So they have a responsibility to kind of light fire under us to make sure that we stay on track. And we have a responsibility from all these years of seeing everything going on and connecting and understanding that the system bullshit. Yeah. We have to show out and show that we were serious about all the things we've been talking about and tweeting about. It's easy to tweet and say all this rah rah, but all right, now you're in a position of power. What are you going to do?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant point. I always said that I never wanted to be the older person that was kind of getting in the way with my older politics in a world that was evolving faster than I could tolerate to keep up with. And so I take that really seriously. And I look to Gen Z now for their leadership in a lot of ways, because I'm either going to get it from other millennials or I'm going to get it from them. And you're right. Like, we should be kind of like shifting the power dynamic here, where instead of the people that hold political offices being 60 or 70 years old or older, It's like, no, let's get the fresh blood in there. I mean, relatively speaking,
Right.
and allow the evolution to happen, because we're calling for the evolution. But I think the fact that so many of our leaders are older, that they're stalling us out in this place that we don't want to be anymore. And everybody keeps saying that, but they're not doing anything about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. I mean, like even with the idea of police and defunding police, I don't support it in its entirety. I think money just needs to be kind of reallocated. But that's definitely a larger conversation. But being in that position, right? If we're getting rid of all the bad cops, then who's filling the role? Like if we as a generation are saying these cops are bad and this system needs to change, we should be making the effort to be that next class of police officers who are really going to show how the work needs to be done. We need to run for the offices that again will show people like this is how what community is. We have these established communities online. We have Reddit, we have Twitter. I think those are like the main communication ones, but there's an awareness of each other and the work we do, and you can see everyone's track record. So any millennial and anyone who's of legal age to run for office and who wants to kind of promote change and who has been voicing change, then these are the people. They need to step up. I've never envisioned myself kind of running for office. Like to me, it's dope that John like took that risk, but like had that idea and fire behind him to want to do that, to want to change his town. And past couple of years, I've like, maybe, I'm a fair person. And I think that's one of the most important things when it comes to being any person in a authoritative role, excuse me. So, maybe 10 years from now, once I kind of settle out what I want to do with my life, maybe it is something that I kind of consider. But everyone in their 30s and late 20s, this is the time to really start putting the work in, getting your name out so that we can start the transition. And like you said, get the evolution going.
Yeah. And I think that like not everybody's going to be built for political roles, and there's not enough space for everybody anyway. But what I think I've been wanting to challenge people to do is like find what your thing is, your way of being a leader in this, even if it's in just your community, not in a political way, but like granted, book clubs are not the things that need to be happening now, but I started one because after the George Floyd situation, there were just so many white people in my personal circle that I saw needed more education. And I thought, well, maybe that's where we need to start. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to lead this. I'm going to say, I'm reading this book. Come read it with me. I will host 2 sessions a week where we all sit and we talk about it and we can hold each other accountable and we can have these conversations that we've never had before. And like, that was a way that I felt comfortable taking a leadership role, because it really taps into like my strengths and my ability to connect with people. Now that's not running for a government office, but it's doing more than I was doing before, which was just sort of pointing at people and saying, you should do better. It's like, well, I'm going to do better. I'm going to model that for you. And I'm going to invite you to come with me. And let's see if maybe that has some legs and can create a bigger wave. So it's like, there's this psychologist or psychotherapist. His name is Michael Mead. And he says that everybody has their own genius. Everybody has their own thing that they can speak through, that they can take leadership through, that they can express themselves through. And I think now's the time for us to really do that and assess how it could be of service to the world that we really want to see, because we're not short of opinions. If you go on Twitter, everybody's got an opinion.
Right.
But follow that up with some kind of action,
Yeah.
Well, and I guess speaking of politics, I mean, John, I don't know if this is like a good time to kind of segue into this kind of cool interview that you got to do.
I think it's a perfect time. So, interview is probably a strong word. It was more like a group discussion. Was it last week? The week before? I got to speak to Amy Kennedy. Amy Kennedy is currently running as a Democrat for the House of Representatives seat in my congressional district. She's hoping to be the Democratic candidate against Jeff Van Drew. Jeff Van Drew won as a Democrat in 2018. Last year, he switched parties and declared his, quote, undying loyalty to Trump, unquote. He is a Weasley rat bastard who I have nothing but ill will towards. So, because of some political work I've done over the past few years, including running for office, I get opportunities sometimes to do kind of neat things. One of them would be sitting down with Amy Kennedy via Zoom, thanks to Ms. Corona, and just kind of hearing her out. So this wasn't an avenue for debate, and I didn't really have a lot of time to ask her a lot of questions. So that's important to recognize. I couldn't really press her on things. It just wasn't that type of format. I'm going to go into a little bit of a soliloquy here. If you have questions or anything, just interrupt me, please. I'd love for more discussion. Just let me know. All right, so before we really get started, it should be noted that I hold a real and true appreciation for any politician who makes the effort to connect with their people. Though we fundamentally disagree on some issues, Amy Kennedy is pretty all right in my book for reaching out and meeting with this little group of people that I belong to. And a few days later, she called me personally to follow up on something. And again, I truly appreciate that, and that makes me think reasonably highly of her. I also want to add the qualifier that whatever I say here is not necessarily an attack on Amy herself. I don't know her personally, but from our limited interactions, she seems like a fundamentally decent person, which again counts for quite a bit in my book. There's a good chance I'll be voting for her in November. I think she's pretty strongly favored to win the Democratic primary. Importantly, though, I'm not going to vote for her in June, and I didn't, in fact. Primaries, in my opinion, are for deciding which direction the party should go, and I don't feel that her opinions are they don't match my own in that regard. From what I can tell, Amy Kennedy is in this next generation of this lingering rail of Clinton Democrats that we can't really seem to shake. Sort of in that, like, Mayor Pete or Kamala Harris vibe. Not necessarily that she has the baggage that they do, but just in their general political platforms. They're progressive to a point, and even like 8 years ago would be considered a revelation. They're big name, big money politicians that aren't really willing to take strong leaps or strong stands, even if it's just to shift this Overton window that's situated so far to the right that Mitt fucking Romney has centrist creds, and to shift that just back a little bit to the left. It is worth noting she's far more progressive than the likes of Hillary and Joe Biden, but there's just a few key areas that kind of cemented the fact that I'm not going to be voting for her in the primaries. First, the last name is important here. Amy Kennedy's married to Patrick Kennedy, who was in Congress a few years ago. Patrick Kennedy is the son of Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy is obviously the brother of John F. Kennedy. And, like, is there ever a name more associated with the past and with this, like, rose-colored glass golden age of America and, like, this desire to leap backwards into what never really was? It's hard to say someone should be held accountable for their name. Amy is not her husband. She is not her father-in-law. She's not her cousin. She's not JFK. What she is, though, is a glaring example of how political dynasties inhabit this country, which is ostensibly a democratic republic with freely held elections. How does having yet another Kennedy in office really move this country forward? Though research is limited, I found a 2018 study published by Harvard that there is evidence that a political dynasty will have negative long-term economic effects. The heir, as it were, to the throne will be able to coast on enough political capital that they basically won't make continuing effort to actually produce for their people. While it's impossible to say how far Amy falls into the Kennedy lineage in terms of political capital, I think it's certainly an idea worth discussing and worth noting. Do we really need more Roosevelts? Do we need another Bush? Do we need another Clinton? How many Kennedys are enough Kennedys before we decide to take a chance on someone who hasn't received as much of a voice and who would have a different perspective not clouded by the status of royalty? That's something, again, it might not be fair to her, but it's something that really enters my mind. Like, I don't want to see the same names in office all the time. I don't think it's fair, and I don't think it's truly representative of the people. I'm a progressive. I'm pretty confident saying that. I'm what most normal people would probably consider a leftist, and what Twitter, being Twitter, would probably consider a centrist chud. I don't really have a strong name for my politics. Like, I'm a Medicare for all evangelist. I fully believe that all drugs should be decriminalized and most should just frankly be legalized. But at the same time, I'm mostly like pro-gun. I don't think far-reaching gun control is a thing that should happen. It's a constitutionally protected right, and the idea of people trying to take that away kind of scares me. It sets a bad precedent. And I do have these core beliefs brought about through discussion and endless hours of reading that have shaped me well enough. Amy isn't whatever I am, and that's fine. Most aren't, but she isn't exactly a Bernie disciple either. And Bernie was kind of my guy. I viewed him as a chance to take a step. We don't have a lot of politicians that I can say will give me that air of hope. She reminds me sort of Mayor Pete, as I said earlier. She's willing to say nice things, but she wants to make sure the boat doesn't get rocked too hard or too fast. And there's a place for this. This is probably the place of compromise. This is where you end. This is where if you end here on some initial measures, you can sort of hold your chin up. But starting from here, starting from the middle, isn't going to get anyone very far. The right wing of this country has shifted ideology across the board so far to the right that to argue from the middle is to argue from like the neocon perspective of the early 2000s at this point. It's very easy for them to get what they want because they've shifted political discussion so far in that direction. Distressingly to me, Amy does not support Medicare for all. Instead, what she really wants is an expansion of the mess that is the Affordable Care Act and a quote-unquote Medicare for all who want it. That is such a horseshit thing to me, I can't get over it. Everyone wants health care. No one wants to go to the doctor and be denied coverage or be faced with such a ridiculous medical bill that they'll never be able to pay it off. Medicare for all who want it is a dumb term that I don't know which political strategist came up with that. Bothers me to no end.
What does that mean? I'm sorry.
Exactly.
What does that mean?
Exactly. It's a nonsense phrase.
Like money for all who wants it. Everyone wants homes for all who wants it. Everyone wants a home. Like, what are you talking
I'm good. I'm all right.
I'm confident saying it's dumb. And just including that on your website is enough for me to just kind of shake my head and back away slowly. It's many much smarter, more eloquent people than I have done a lot of research into, the efficacy of Medicare for all. You can find that research anywhere. I remember earlier this year, the fucking Koch brothers published a study that said Medicare for all would probably save us money. So it's, in my opinion, it's really hard to argue against it. The only arguments you can say are like, it will cost us money, and, but what about the insurance companies? Both of which I think are ridiculous arguments, and I don't really give them much agency. Amy also does not support legalizing marijuana. She supports decriminalization.
Boo.
I think that's real dumb too. It's very dumb. The reasons why for this, I do think are kind of interesting, and not that they're right, but just I haven't heard these reasons before. She said that she is worried about advertising and marketing it towards children like vape or jewel manufacturers did, which again, I find dumb. Literally in the legislation you write to legalize marijuana, you can write advertising like information and guidelines into that. There's no stopping you there. You can just flatly say there can't be advertisement. You can go that far. It's fine. People still buy a shitload of pot. Like, it's all right.
Yeah, in fact, legalizing it would grant the government actual permission to do that, whereas, like in LA or in California, it was always like medicinally legal and only recently recreational, but like there's less regulating on that you can do. If you just make it legal, then you just declare where the parameters are in terms of advertisement.
Yeah.
With alcohol, right? Yeah.
Right.
But like cigarettes, you can't advertise cigarettes really anymore. Like they have a big fucking warning label on the box that says, these are going to kill you. Do you still want to buy it? Right. Yeah. I genuinely don't understand that argument. And it's one of those things. Unfortunately, like I said, this wasn't an opportunity for me to like debate her, because that's one of those ones that stuck to me as just didn't make sense. And it was real short-sighted. The other reason she gave, though, is a lot more, well, actually, she didn't give this reason, but through a tiny bit of digging here, I found what might be one, and it's a lot more personal. I'm not sure if this is one she holds, but someone very close to her husband, does. Patrick Kennedy, when he was in office, he had a similar line. He didn't support legalization, but he did support decriminalization. The reason for this is he is an addict, and his father notoriously had addiction problems, and so did his uncle JFK. That's why he didn't support legalization. He didn't like the idea of another drug, another toxicant being freely available on the market. Take that for what you will. I don't know if Amy feels that same way for that same reason, but I think it's pretty important to note.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely important to note. And I guess the therapist in me wants to say, like, addicts are going to find what they need when they need it. And I hope that that's not part of the reason behind trying to continue the prohibition of marijuana, especially when other things that you can also be addicted to, like cigarettes, coffee, alcohol, those are all totally cool and like normalized. So I totally respect his experience doing that. I just hope that that's not really what's behind her thinking.
Yeah, again, for the same reason, like I think, I don't know, it's not affording the people writ large like the benefit of the doubt or the same agency that someone who likes to drink gets. Like, and that's not fair at all to me. But
Exactly.
again, yeah, I wasn't able to really press her on that one. Amy was also asked about her stance on Black Lives Matter, the Green New Deal, and other such things. She maintains a solid rhetoric of being a lowercase p progressive, if that makes sense. She has been marching with protesters in local protests, so, shouts to her for doing the minimum. She does believe in some criminal justice reform, though in terms of like defunding the police or reallocating assets, she doesn't really go into that very much. She's in favor of establishing new things like mental health courts and drug courts, more diversionary practices so people don't get sent to jail. I think that's a great idea. My senior thesis was on drug courts and the efficacy of them. They're great. More of them should exist. That way you're not sending addicts to prison, because that's just the dumbest fucking possible thing you can do.
Absolutely.
But, yeah. I'm sorry, real quick. We are allowed to curse on this podcast, right? Because I have...
Hell yeah.
I love that Vanessa just went straight for it. Hell yeah.
Now that I'm deep into this and I've said enough of the curse words here, but she doesn't really mention anything about defunding the police. I don't know. I think having people open to criminal justice reform and frankly advocating for it is a positive, no matter how you spin it. But it's just one of those things where, especially in a primary, you're not running for centrists to vote for you. You're running for your own party to vote for you. To not take that next step forward just seems a little lacking to me. On the Green New Deal, she supports a lot of the ideas behind it, but would like to see more specifics in terms of cost and like how each of those things would benefit the society. Again, I don't see it necessarily as a bad thing to be pragmatic, but how much environmental credit do you really get if cost is your main concern rather than the overall effect of something?
The planet, right?
Yeah, like, you're right. You should make sure the things you're doing make at least some level of sense from a monetary perspective, because money's fake, but it, as we understand it and as we use it, is still theoretically finite. So I get that, but again, man, it's the primary. You're running for your party. This is where you're allowed to like let that blue flag fly a little bit and say, hey, those are some really great ideas. And just leave it there. Like, you don't have to qualify them here. Yeah.
It seems like a big indication of just that middle of the road place that she's trying to stay, right? Everything is like, yeah, I support this, but only halfway. I support this, but only halfway. Like, it's all, it's people pleasing, which politics is in a lot of ways, but you want her to take more of a stance.
Absolutely. And again, it's the primaries. I can understand and to a slight degree even respect if you're taking these more middle of the road stances in a general election where you're trying to unseat the incumbent. Then I get it. You're trying to win more people that are probably more skeptical over. I get it. It's the primaries. Yeah. You're trying to win people like me over, people that actually bother to vote in these things. Because there ain't many. And this type of attitude isn't something that's going to make me vote for you. It just isn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you feel like she's... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you seem pretty like, you were very curious. You were doing a lot of your research, I know, before you got to sit in on this conversation, but you seem like so certain right now. You're like, done. She's not my person. She
isn't. Like I said, there's a really strong chance I'll be voting for her in November. Whoever is a Democratic candidate running against Jeff Van Drew gets my vote. It's just one of those things. I hate Jeff Van Drew more than I can say. He sucks. And she will be a vast improvement over him. Like, that much is certainly true. But because it's... Go ahead. No, you're good.
Do you feel like she's still trying to find her identity? Because I feel like a lot of her... I mean, focusing on Medicare for all who wants it. It goes back... like the theme of the podcast. She's like sitting in the gray, either trying to figure out where she really wants to go or just leaving herself open for everyone who for people who are just unsure, who are undecided. Do you feel that way at all?
I mean, to an extent, as far as I understand, this is her first time running for office, which, I mean, damn. Like, running for Congress your first time around. All right. So I do think there's that to an extent. Really do think it's important to see, like, where she's come from. Her father was a local politician in South Jersey, but the family she married into, like, these are the type of progressives that the Kennedys have notoriously been. They're capital D Democrats. Like, they run a little bit left of center, but they're not going to be people that really shake the foundations of the planet here. And I think she is falling into that mold a bit. There are much worse things than that, but there's also better things. And for me, that was where I fall into. It's like, well, no, this other guy, Will Cunningham, who is an openly gay black guy from really right around where I live. He worked for the Sanders campaign. He holds a lot of the same ideals I do. It's like, yeah, I'm going to vote for him. He's the one that makes more sense to me.
Yeah, I love that idea of like, there are much worse things, but that's not how I want to really like guide my vote, which I feel like has just become the kind of slogan of voting in American politics. It's like, well, it could be worse, I guess, right? And it's like, we're tired of, especially in this conversation where, like you mentioned before, like the middle is getting wider and the I don't want to say extremes, although I guess in a lot of ways they are extremes, but like there are statements that are being made. There are opinions that are definitive. There's like not always this like wishy-washy stuff. There are people that stand for something. And I'm under no illusions that there's one candidate out there that's going to represent everything that I'm for and believe in. But aren't you just tired of like, there are much worse people to vote for? It's like, I want to go up there and be like, hell yeah, I'm proud to be voting for this person because they do stand for something. And I believe that they're going to do something with it. That's
absolutely
the energy we need these days.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I was a pretty big fan of one Bernie Sanders. Like, yeah,
right,
dude rocks.
Totally.
Yeah, that's why I still voted for him in the primary, even though it's effectively over. Like, no, again, primaries are where you choose how the party goes. I like his version of it, so I'm going to vote for him. To end this little bit here on a more positive note for Amy, on her website, prior to our conversation with her, she said that she would like a low-cost COVID vaccine for everyone. I called her out on that because that's bullshit. Like, no, you're automatically putting up barriers for a thing that literally determines the health of the world. So, yeah, like, it just doesn't make sense. She was actually taken aback. She didn't realize that was on her website. And she called me personally like a couple days later to tell me that she had changed the wording of it. And on her website does say, guarantee a free vaccine. So I really do applaud her for that. I think that takes a decent amount of courage to admit like where you've gone wrong and to adjust what your viewpoints are. That gives me some hope that, hey, she's listening to the people that are talking to her. I applaud her for that. Genuinely. I think that's a great thing to do.
That's dope. Yeah. Was there any panic when you first picked up the phone? Did you think she was sending the goons after you?
Well, no, I actually thought she was going to have more to say about my other question that I asked that I'll get to in a second here. But no, she comes across as a very friendly person. Okay. Everything I've ever encountered about her says she's very friendly. She seemed it. Again, there are significantly worse people to vote for. She's not terrible. I think she's fine.
I could just see that on her on the yard signs. She's not terrible.
She's just fine.
Amy Kennedy, fine. Your okayest choice. Great. Like,
I mean, that's the base for, like Vanessa was saying, that's the base for all American politics now, right? Just like, he's okay. He's better than other guy. He's okay. Well, she's okay. He's better than other guy, right?
Yeah. And again, I don't think I don't know. Like, that's where I am with her. So before I get into the last thing I asked her, I'm going to ask you guys a question real quick. If you could ask a person running for Congress or someone sitting in Congress currently one question, what would it be?
Oh God.
Okay, that's a loaded question, caught off guard question.
I have a problem with brevity, so I can only ask one question. I don't know. I mean, I might ask something topical right now about maybe law enforcement and budgets, city budgets and things like that, just because of where we're at right now?
I think I'd be interested in maybe prison reform.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't have a direct question, but
yeah, that's fair. I mean, I just put you on the spot there. It's all good.
I'll be prepared. I'll be prepared for random questions next episode. I didn't know we were catching each other off guard. I would have came up with
prepared for random questions.
Right. That should be in the notes. One random question each.
So what I've thought, this is something I've thought about for a long time. For a while, in my academic career and post-academic career, I taken a lot to studying the Middle East. I find it fascinating. It's the most just complicated place you can possibly think of. And a lot of time in the Middle East is with U.S. use of force there. You'll see civilians being targeted directly or indirectly. The Obama administration was notoriously bad for this. I strongly consider him a war criminal for his actions there. The Trump administration is much worse than him. So the question I asked Amy Kennedy was, given that you're running for Congress, if you win, you'll have the power of the purse. I mean, the Congress hasn't declared war officially since World War II, but they're the ones who decide where funding goes, and because they decide where funding goes, they still wield a lot of power there. Esther, do you think when going to war, what is more valuable? The lives of innocent civilians or that of U.S. troops? Now, that's a real hard question. And I sprung it on her, much like I did the last one with you. She didn't really have an answer for that, and that's fair. I didn't expect it. It's just one of those things like, I have this opportunity. I'm curious to see where it goes. That's what I thought she was calling to talk to me about. It wasn't, but
that's a tough question.
Yeah, no, there's no easy to answer there, but I think it's important. I mean, something like 1 million civilians have died in Iraq and Syria over the past 20 years. It's just, it doesn't get discussed enough. The fact that the actions that larger states and veritable empires like the United States is the effects they have on the populace. And I think it's incredibly important. And it's something that, should be drilled into the mind of every single person who has any remote control of those actions. Like the Obama administration killed a bunch of people at a Yemeni wedding party. They killed an American teenager with a drone strike. And I use the Obama administration just because he's seen as the relative good guy of the last, ever of American politics. It's something that you really have to stare in the face of, and I don't think enough people do. So that's why I asked it. But yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah, what's your answer? Right? What's your answer, John? I guess we all can answer that. That'll be interesting.
So again, she didn't have a real answer for that. I get it. I'm not upset about that because that's a ridiculous question. And yeah.
But I would hope that, I think the question can serve as a good conversation starter, right? Because I don't know that there even is an answer, right? It's it's an impossible question, which means that it's worth talking about because there's really important things happening. And part of the reason that we might be ignoring it is because it is so difficult. It's going to be hard to look at. It's going to be hard to make better decisions. It's going to be hard to accept that this has been happening for so long and under people that we convinced ourselves were better than that. There's a lot that we have to face in that. So I think it's a cool question in that I would never expect an answer, but I would hope for a conversation from it. Right.
Again, she didn't really have an answer, which is fine. Some of the other people in the chat were like, oh, that's not a fair question. So, it is what it is. But to sum up here, overall, I think, like I said, Amy is fine. She's not a capital P progressive. She's not a democratic socialist. She's not any of that thing. But I do think she's a decent human being. And I don't think having a decent human being in office is a bad thing at any level. That's kind of where I am with her. Okay, if I have to vote for her, I'm not going to be angry.
I get that. Decent human being 2020. Yeah. All about that. That's awesome work, man. I mean, good for you for showing up and asking the literal tough question. And now I'm terrified to be doing this podcast with you. Wow. So for our first episode, I feel like we really we did something here. We ran a full conversation all over the place, but like in a really cohesive way, which I really appreciated hearing from you both and getting to talk to you guys. So we're going to do these episodes every 2 weeks. And so you can follow along on the podcast platforms, subscribe so that you can get notifications when we get new episodes up. You can also follow us on Instagram and Twitter at YTGrayBLKPod. You can follow me on Instagram at The Hungry Feminine. And John?
You can follow me on Twitter at King of Rums.
Nice. I love John's. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Galtz Conditioning, GALTS Conditioning. Also, starting the next episode, we'll be introducing a kind of a top 5 list that allows us all to kind of show different sides of ourselves outside of just our focus on the political arena. So something more lighthearted and gives the listeners a chance to learn more about us, but also gives us a chance to learn more about each other also.
Yeah, we're not always this serious.
and miserable and upset at the world.
Right, and just angry about everything.
Well, actually.
Well, we are, but we can also have a sense of humor.
Right.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining and listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.